Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to do an August wrap-up. So August for me was a month where I decided that I was going to focus on clearing out my Netgalley shelf. I don't know if you're like me, but I have this tendency to scroll through Netgalley and look at all the books and think, oh gee, I haven't reviewed a whole lot of books, so I'm probably not going to get approved for the majority of the ones I request. So then I sit there and I request and I request and I request, thinking like, oh, I'm just going to get maybe 1 in 10 of these books. And then inevitably I get approved for almost all of them and I end up with like 100 books on my shelf. So in an effort to finish reviewing all of these books that I mass requested, I decided that I would concentrate my TBR this month on that specifically. And Netgalley was there to help with their Netgalley Summer Bingo. I found out about that via Instagram and I was really excited because there's a whole bunch of different prompts. And when I can turn anything into a competition, it helps me really like get into it and be a bit more motivated. So this was just the thing I needed. So we're gonna first talk statistics, and I'm gonna give you my ratings of each of the books that I read, and then at the end, I will go over the Netgalley Bingo card and show you exactly what I completed for each of the different categories. In the month of August, I completed 20 books. That goes to a total of 6,991 pages. That breaks down to about 350 pages per book on average. My fiction to nonfiction breakdown was 15% nonfiction and 85% fiction. This is actually a little bit better than typical months for me. Usually I'm like in 5 to 10% nonfiction. This month I finished 3 nonfiction books, which was 1 book more than usual. The longest book that I've read this month was The Once and Future Witches by Alix Harrow. That was about 528 pages. My shortest book was Thornhedge by Kingfisher. That was about 116 pages. So now we're going to talk about how I rated each of these books. So we're going to start with the lowest ratings and work our way to the highest ratings. I do want to say that I will give you a little bit of a description and a little explanation about the rating as I go, but I'm going to try and keep everything brief because we have 20 books to talk about. So first up, we're going to start with the 3-star reads. Now, these 3 stars are not in any particular order in the 3-star category. First up was Where There Was Fire by Manuel Arias. This is a book set in Costa Rica and it deals with a plantation. It's a multi-generational story and we see basically the effects of this horrible catastrophic plantation fire and how it trickles through the generations. I expected to love this book. I love multi-generational sagas. I love books set in South and Central America. I was really excited because I've been to Costa Rica, so I was looking forward to kind of getting back into that Costa Rican vibe. Unfortunately for me, this book dragged a bit. I appreciated the exploration of how massive corporations have profited off of Central America while keeping the population poor. This is a very relevant topic, something that has affected large parts of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. So I think thematically it was an incredibly relevant book. I just thought that the delivery wasn't all the way there. Unfortunately, parts of it were really slow, parts of it were a little bit faster. It was a little confusing in places. It just didn't quite deliver what I wanted. The writing was really beautiful and I could see Manuel Arias being an author that in the future is going to come up with some brilliant books. And then I had Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson on this list. Now, before you come at me, because I know this is going to be an unpopular position here, this book was beautifully written. If you've read Azumah Nelson before, then you're gonna know that he writes beautiful prose. His description is just brilliant. And that is absolutely true for this book. However, I found this to be very slow. It kind of dragged at points. While there were parts that were really interesting to me, it didn't really captivate me like Nelson's previous book did. And then we have At the Coffee Shop of Curiosities by Heather Weber. This is what I would say is like a cozy mystery romance with a little bit of magical realism and fantasy sprinkled in. It's not my typical genre, but I decided to give it a try because the premise sounded really interesting. We have a woman whose boyfriend died, and then she receives a mysterious letter that kind of encourages her to go apply for a position as a caretaker for an elderly person. And this brings her to a new town and a new circle of friends and kind of a ghost story that's unfolding. Unfortunately for me, this book was very cliche. I kind of had inklings of where things were going far before they were actually going there. And it really leaned into a lot of tropes that I don't enjoy. I'm not typically a romance reader, and this tended to be a little bit more romance heavy than I necessarily wanted. It was okay, but it just wasn't really my vibe. A reader who's more into romance and like cutesy stuff will probably enjoy this much more than I did. Then we have Thornhedge by Kingfisher. So this is a novella, it is fantasy, and this is my second time reading Kingfisher. I really appreciated the fantasy element. I have only read T. Kingfisher's horror previously, so it's kind of interesting seeing her delve into something a little different. That said, I feel like due to the novella format, the story was a little bit overly simplified. The conclusion was a little bit abrupt, and I felt like everything just wrapped up a little bit too neat and tidy. I wanted a little more conflict. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the story. It just, for me, felt a little superficial, and I think again that was because of the page constraints of 116 pages. Then I had After the Forest by Kell. This is in the 3-star category, but probably on the higher end of the 3 stars. This is a Hansel and Gretel retelling. It kind of takes place after the original story unfolds. So Hansel and Gretel are kind of living in a new town, and this is dealing with the repercussions of what they've been through. It was a little darker than the original story in that we're getting like that post-traumatic stress and this dysfunction in the siblings and them trying to deal with the fallout. I thought the concept was interesting. I thought the writing was pretty good. I think my biggest issue was this one was a lot longer than I think it needed to be. It could have been trimmed down. There are parts that go really slow and parts that go really fast. It's a little bit uneven. That said, this is Wood's debut work, so I would expect some good things from her in the future. Then I read Out of the Dawn by PC Cast. This is the second book in this series, and I really enjoyed it. This is about a post-apocalyptic scenario. So we have like a green mist that comes in, kills off all the men, and then transforms the women into having different types of supernatural abilities. So if you didn't come in contact with this green mist, you're still as you were prior to the green mist. So there are men that survive, obviously. It's just any man that has like actual contact with the mist dies. So we have a mostly female cast, and they are looking for a safe place to rebuild a community. And they're looking at their rules for the world and how they're going to run this new society that they're building. I thought this was a pretty interesting book. I really like the concept of this post-apocalyptic world that's run by women. I really liked seeing the way that these different women want to build a new society and the rules that they set and the way that they stick with them. I also thought that the concept of this green mist and it affecting different genders in different ways was very interesting. That said, I feel like the evil villain in this story is like a caricature of an evil villain, and his sidekick was like a caricature of the evil villain sidekick. I wish that more time and care had been put into writing the antagonists of the story because it would have been a lot better for it. Then I read Inkblood's Sister Scribe by Emma Torzs. This was a book that was okay. It started out really interesting. We have a character that's in Antarctica and she is doing research, and then she's having some issues with mirrors, and there's like this whole magical background that she grew up with. Her parents were kind of split. Her dad raised her one way while her mom was trying to convince her of something else, and she goes on the run. I was really invested up to like about 30% of the book, and then it just kind of started to really drag for me. It stopped being super exciting and super engaging, and I just really lost interest. I got through it, but it was a struggle, and so for me it was just a so-so read. Then I had If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. So I just think that dark academia is not my thing. I have read so many wildly popular dark academia books, and they always come in at about 3 stars for me. This one is no different. So we have a group of actors, and one of them dies, and this is a character who's been accused of that murder in jail, reflecting on what happened leading up to the death. The overall concept for the book was interesting. I thought the open-ended ending was kind of interesting as well, but it just felt so pretentious and heavy-handed to me, and I think in general that's the way dark academia just feels to me. It just feels ultra pretentious, and like it's just not my vibe. So I think that probably this book is actually rated higher for most people, but for me, since this genre just does not seem to be my thing, I put it at a 3 star. And then I read Shighidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon by Wole Talabi. This book takes place in a world where religions are represented by corporations and different deities are employees of those corporations. Shighidi is a Orisha who is losing power, and he doesn't have a lot of like followers anymore, people praying to him, and so he's trying to make a resurgence. I was excited going into this book. This book is based on the Yoruba religion, so I was curious to see how those elements would be used within this story. I think where this went wrong for me is that this book was like 50% sex, and very explicitly so. One of the main characters is a succubus, and while that part does make sense, it was a lot more graphic content than I really wanted, and it was hard for me to get engaged in the story. Like, there was parts of the story that I really liked, and then we would flash to a really graphic sex scene that just kind of derailed the whole thing for me. In some ways, this book reminds me of American Gods by Neil Gaiman, because there is kind of a similar grittiness to it, and it deals with deities in a different way than we typically think of them. But it just unfortunately lacked like the captivating factor that American Gods had for me. Next are my 4-star reads. First up is Ithaca by Claire North. This is the first book in a series of books that follows Penelope from Greek mythology. So in this particular book, we have Penelope, who is trying to chase away and fight off suitors. Her husband Odysseus has been gone for a long period of time, and everybody assumes that he is dead. She believes that he will be returning, and she refuses to marry anyone. Clytemnestra shows up on her island, having recently murdered her husband Agamemnon. She pleads with Penelope to hide her, and Penelope does so. Then we have Electra and Orestes, the children of Clytemnestra, who show up demanding that Penelope turn over their mother, or at least help in the search to find Clytemnestra and bring her to justice. Penelope is torn between two sides. Penelope staggers under the weight of the expectations of all these suitors, the pressure from Orestes and Electra to turn over Clytemnestra, and the secret knowledge that Clytemnestra is hiding on her island. This was a fantastic start to this series. I have read a lot of books about Clytemnestra and Helen and all of the different women in Greek mythology, but I have not read a book yet that is set from Penelope's perspective. So I really enjoyed that. Penelope is very clever, and she would actually make a fantastic ruler. So if Odysseus never returned, her island would be fine. I actually have an ARC of House of Odysseus, which is the second book in this series, and I'm very much looking forward to getting into that. Then I have The Edge of Sleep by Willie Black and Jake Emmanuel. So this is a book I'm not sure I know how to describe. I requested an ARC of it because of the cover and because of the description of kind of a post-apocalyptic situation. I kind of forgot about it, and then when I was in Denver a month ago, I was in a bookstore, I asked for recommendations, and one of the girls at the bookstore said that this particular book was one of her favorites. And I was like, oh, I have an ARC of that. So when I got home, I started reading it, and it ended up being a 4-star read for me. It is post-apocalyptic, but not really in the way that you would expect. Basically, we have a situation where one night, everyone that falls asleep dies, and the only people that are left on Earth are the people that did not sleep. So we have like a nurse that's working a 24-hour shift. We have a guy that has severe PTSD and can't sleep. We have another guy who's had like extreme night terrors since he was a little kid. And it kind of continues that way. So as we meet different people in the story, all of them have different insomnia related issues. And they go on a very strange adventure to try to stay awake so that they don't die. This book was like an acid trip, honestly, or at least what I imagine an acid trip must be like. It is wild. There's a lot going on. It's really confusing. It feels like a very vivid hallucination. Upon researching this book after I read it, I found out that the concept for it was from a podcast that was on air and wildly popular, with different characters talking about this experience as the podcast progressed. I've heard that it's since actually been auctioned off for TV rights to be a TV series, and then they've also turned it into a book. Where this book left off, I'm assuming that there's going to be like a book 2 and a book 3. But yeah, I don't know that this book will be for everybody, but I certainly liked it. If you like really weird and quirky, this might be for you. And then we have The Sun and the Void by Gabriela Romero Lacruz. This is a fantasy set in South America, and it deals a lot with power and deities and what our limits are in our search for family and acceptance and things like that. Typically, as a genre, I find that fantasy is very European-centric, followed by a little bit American-centric. And so anytime that I see fantasies that are outside of those particular regions, I am really excited about it. I fell in love with the cover of this book. The concept was really interesting. The writing was pretty good. It wasn't quite a 5-star read for me just because I would have liked to delve even further into the characters and what was going on, but I think this is a promising start to the series. Then I had Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. I have a full-scale review of this book up here, as well as a review of Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia, if you're interested in further detail. Overall, this one was decent for me, but not as good as The Hacienda. We do have some horror aspect. There are vampires, but they're not the type of vampires you're thinking of. There's a lot more romance than you're gonna expect. And The best part of this book for me was the setting. I love that this was set around the Mexican-American War in northern Mexico, and I love that we see the conflict of the gringos coming down from the north and trying to invade and take more territory for the United States. Then I have the first of my nonfiction reads for the month, and that is Pulling the Chariot of the Sun by Shane McCrae. So this is a memoir, and it's super hard to judge a memoir. So take my rating of this with a grain of salt. This is Shane's story of growing up. He is born to a Black father and a white mother, and his racist white grandparents kidnap him. And they convince him as a very young child that his father hated him and he abandoned him and he wanted nothing to do with him. And they raised him to hate himself and to be ashamed of his skin color. And it's just, the details of what he went through are horrifying. It's just heartbreaking to believe that this kind of thing still happens in the world today. First of all, let me say that this is an incredibly brave story to tell. So just on that note alone, this deserves all the praise. On a technical aspect, the reason that I gave this a 4-star instead of a 5-star is because for me, this book felt too short and it felt like it cut off at the wrong spot. We explore McCrae's life with his racist grandparents, the process of indoctrination and brainwashing and like all the lies that they told him and his kidnapping and everything. But I wanted to know more about him now. I wanted to know what happened after he escaped his grandparents. I wanted more details about, reuniting with his father and like dealing with all the trauma that was put on him by these horrible grandparents of his. And unfortunately, we don't get that much of that story. Perhaps it will be another book down the road, or perhaps that's just too personal for him to share, and there is no judgment on that. I just felt like for me as a reader, it left me with this just big gaping hole and a need to know more. Then we have The Weaver and the Witch Queen by Genevieve Gornichec. So I read The Witch's Heart earlier this year and I absolutely loved it. I was really excited when I got an arc of The Weaver and the Witch Queen. For me, this one wasn't quite as good as The Witch's Heart, but was still really good. It follows 3 women, 2 of which are siblings and 1 who is their best friend. It deals with the abduction of one sibling, and then the friend becomes like a very powerful sorceress, and there's all these like interweaving stories. It's a very hard book to summarize. I enjoyed it. If you like The Witch's Heart, you will likely enjoy this one as well. It's got that kind of same quirky Norse mythology vibe. There's a lot going on. It also has that kind of like acid trip phenomenon where you're like, am I hallucinating? What's happening at certain points of this story? But I find that Genevieve Gornichec is a really excellent storyteller. So even though there are confusing aspects and there's a lot happening, I thought overall it was really well done. Then I read Wednesday's Child by Yiyun Lee. Earlier this year, I read The Book of Goose, which I really enjoyed, and that kind of sent me on the path of reading Lee's other works. Earlier this year, I read one of her other short story compilations and really enjoyed that. So when I saw Wednesday's Child pop up on Netgalley, I immediately requested it and was pleased to receive a copy. This is a really interesting short story collection. Each story deals with motherhood in some aspect or the other. One that particularly stands out to me is the perspective of like a nanny, a postpartum nanny who comes in and cares for a baby while mother is recovering. And she is the nanny for like a wealthy family, and the mother really wants nothing to do with her child. I thought that was a very interesting perspective, but all of the stories are very interesting, some better than others, but I thought this was a pretty cool collection of stories. Then I had A Place for Us by Fatima Mirza. This was a book that was recommended to me by Hannah at Savage Reads. I have an entire video of me reviewing the books that she selected for me up here. If you're interested in a little bit more detail, feel free to click on that link. A Place for Us follows a Muslim Indian American family as they deal with their relationships. We see the story from perspective of each of the different members in the family. I would say that the most poignant ones are probably the son, who's dealing with a drug addiction and has really disappointed his parents in a lot of ways. He really feels the weight of their expectations. This book is really beautiful in terms of description. It's very literary feeling. It is a little bit slower and it is very character focused. So if you're looking for a lot of action and plot, this might not be the book for you. But if you love a good character exploration, definitely pick this one up. And finally, my 5-star reads. First, I have The Once and Future Witches by Alix E. Harrow. This was one of Hannah's recommendations as well. This is what I would call historical fiction meets fantasy. It deals a lot with the women's suffrage movement and the disappearance of witchcraft and the persecution of women as witches. This is a really fantastic book. It is the longest book I read this month, but it didn't feel that long at all. I really had to ration out the pages because I was enjoying it so much. My second 5-star read of the month was Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a book that follows the Sackler dynasty and Purdue Pharma and the invention of OxyContin and what becomes the modern day opioid crisis here in the United States. This book is nonfiction, it is infuriating, but it is extremely relevant. It talks a lot about medicine and medical development. It talks about all of the sketchy things that Purdue Pharma did to get OxyContin on the market and how they made it the crisis that it is today. This was another one of Hannah's picks, and like I said, I go into more depth in my video reviewing her 3 selections. My final 5-star read was The Bone Woman by Clea Koff. This deals with the subject of forensic anthropology post-genocide. So Clea Koff is a forensic anthropologist, and she was in Rwanda and Bosnia and Croatia after the various genocides there. And her job was to basically dig up mass graves and use her forensic anthropology skills to determine the age, the gender, the mode of death. The information recovered in her research of these mass graves was used to prosecute people responsible for these various genocides and also used to bring closure to many of the victims' families. She also talks about a very gruesome subject with a lot of thought and care, and without making it overly graphic for the average reader. I was able to get through this book, and while it was difficult at points, I didn't find myself like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed by all of the detail here. This was clear, concise, and if you're interested in the topic of forensic anthropology, particularly in relationship to crime and genocide, this is a book you should read. So my average rating for the entire month was a 3.7. That's a little bit lower than my usual. I think usually I'm between 3.8 and a 3.9. I had a lot of reads that were in that 3-star category, and while I did have a fair handful of 4 stars, I only had 3 5 stars. So sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles. My favorite read of the month was The Bone Woman by Clea Koff. This book was fascinating to me. Like I said, if you're interested in forensic anthropology, I definitely recommend this book. My least favorite read of the month was At the Coffee Shop of Curiosities by Heather Weber. This just wasn't the right book for me. I'm not a romance fan. I don't love like cliche cutesy books typically, and that's kind of what this book was. I think if you want something that's an overall pleasant reading experience, that's not going to challenge you to think too much, and that's going to leave you with that kind of cutesy nice feeling, then you might enjoy this one. And finally, let's get into that Netgalley Bingo card. I'm just going to go over this really briefly so you can see what I used to fill the different prompts. So the first prompt was update your profile. I did that, so that one is complete. For a 5-star read, I had The Bone Woman by Clea Koff. For an author I've read before, I had The Weaver and the Witch Queen by Genevieve Gornichec. A Listen Now audiobook, I did not complete this prompt. Review the oldest book on your shelf. Alas, my oldest book is still sitting there. Favorite color on the cover, I picked up The Sun and the Void by Gabriela Romero Lacruz because all of the colors that I love are on this book cover. And just in general, this book cover was amazing. The next prompt was to raise your feedback ratio. So I did raise my feedback ratio a full 10% during this particular month. That said, of the books that I reviewed, I still have 10 to write the reviews for, so I expect that my feedback ratio will actually raise another 10% by the time that I'm finished. When I started, I was right above 50%, so I expect once I get these reviews in that I should be around 70 to 72%. Outside of your comfort zone, I picked The Coffee Shop of Curiosities by Heather Weber. Didn't really work out for me, but that's okay. The next prompt was a BIPOC author, and I picked Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson. The prompt after that was to listen in the Netgalley Shelf app. I did listen to 4 different books via the Netgalley Shelf app, so that one's crossed off for sure. The next prompt was an LGBTQIA MC. I put The Weaver and the Witch Queen for this because there is a trans main character in there. After that, we have Review After Finishing, and that was The Bone Woman by Clea Koff. Then we had a prompt for publishing in 2024. I did not get to that prompt. We had add a publisher to your favorites. I added several, so that one is complete. Subscribe to Netgalley YouTube. That one is also done. Post a Netgalley shelfie. I did not post a shelfie of my Netgalley. I don't really find a picture of my computer screen all that exciting. And then share a review on TikTok. I shared several reviews on TikTok and via shorts here on YouTube. It's not my preferred format, but I am trying to broaden that a little bit, so that was a good little challenge. The next prompt was to read a Read Now book, which means that it is already approved for anyone to read on Netgalley. I read 2 of those, both of them were cookbooks. Then we had a friend picks what you read prompt. I did not get to this one. And then we had a new to you audiobook narrator. I listened to 4 audiobooks this month via Netgalley, and all 4 of them had narrators that I had not listened to before, so that was pretty exciting. Then we had a debut author prompt. After the Forest by Kell is her debut, so that one counts for that. Then we had a comic or graphic novel. I did not get this prompt at all. And then we had create a list on Netgalley. I'm still unsure how to do that. And the final prompt was to review the book Advocate Toolkit. I did do that, and I kind of refreshed on the policies of Netgalley and how to be the best book advocate possible. So that was my reading for August. You have my books, my ratings, my statistics, my Netgalley bingo card, everything you need to know about what I read in August. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. Comment down below and let me know, how was your reading in August? Did you get to all the books that you wanted to? How many books did you read? Did you read anything off of Netgalley? What did you theme your TBR as? Whatever you feel like you want to tell me about August, let me know. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.